He had rehearsed the evening 100 times in his head, but nothing, not a single version of it, had prepared him for the moment she leaned across the table, candlelight catching the quiet in her eyes, and whispered those 5 words that stopped the whole world from turning. In the space of one breath, everything he thought this night was going to be became something far larger, far more sacred, and far more terrifying than a first date. In that moment, 2 people who had each been quietly drowning in the beautiful, exhausting ocean of raising a child alone looked at each other and finally felt the ground beneath their feet. But to understand what that moment meant, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a man named James. James was 34 years old, and he had the kind of tired in his bones that sleep couldn't touch. He lived in a modest house on a quiet street with his 5-year-old son Noah, and a life that had been carefully rebuilt from the rubble of the one he'd lost. Noah's mother, Priya, had passed away 18 months after Noah was born, a diagnosis that arrived without warning and moved faster than anyone could fight. James had held her hand at the end, then driven himself home in the rain, walked into the nursery where his son was sleeping peacefully in his crib, and stood there in the dark for a very long time, not crying, not moving, just understanding in the deepest and most irreversible way that from this moment forward, everything depended on him. The years that followed were not tragic in the way people imagine grief to be. They were not dramatic or cinematic. They were just relentlessly ordinary. The 4 a.m. wake-ups, the daycare pickups, the fevers that spiked on weeknight evenings when no one else was there to share the worry. They were the birthday cakes baked from scratch because James refused to let Noah feel the absence of celebration, even when he himself felt hollowed out. They were the parent-teacher meetings attended alone, the school plays filmed on a tilting phone, the bedtime prayers that Noah insisted on ending with "and please say hi to Mama in heaven." James would say amen and then sit in the hallway with his back against the wall and breathe. He had not dated. He had not wanted to. The thought of opening himself to another person felt not just risky but somehow disloyal, to Priya's memory, to the careful architecture of the life he had built, to Noah's stability. The world of first dates and tentative texts and the excruciating vulnerability of being seen by a stranger felt like a language he had forgotten entirely. Before we go any further, if this story is already reaching something real inside you, please take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story like this today, and subscribe to our channel, Kindness, because we tell stories for people who still believe in love, in second chances, and in the quiet strength of those who choose to keep going. Now let's get back to James. It was his colleague, B, who finally wore him down. For nearly a year she had been mentioning a woman named Sophie, a friend of a friend, someone B described as kind without being soft, funny without trying, and someone who, in her words, gets it in a way most people don't. James asked what that meant. B looked at him for a moment and said simply that Sophie had her own story, her own reasons for understanding what it meant to carry something heavy and keep walking anyway. He didn't ask more than that, but the phrase stayed with him. He texted Sophie for 2 weeks before suggesting coffee, and then upgraded it to dinner when coffee felt too small for the kind of conversations they'd already been having. They talked about books they'd half finished because life kept interrupting. They talked about the strange guilt that comes with laughing too hard at something when grief is still sitting in the corner of the room. They talked around the edges of their real lives with the careful, instinctive caution of 2 people who had learned that not every person you meet is ready to hold the weight of your truth. James liked her, more than he had given himself permission to expect, and that terrified him. The evening of the date, he drove to the restaurant with his heart performing something close to a medical event. He had asked Noah's grandmother to stay the night, and Noah had sent him off with a handmade card that said, "Good luck, Dad, have fun, don't be weird," in enormous looping crayon letters. James had pressed it briefly to his chest before tucking it in the kitchen drawer, overcome by a love too large for the moment. Sophie was already at the table when he arrived, and the sight of her, relaxed, real, turning from the window to smile at him without any of the performed brightness of someone trying to make a good impression, settled something in him almost immediately. She looked like a person, not a performance. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. They found their rhythm within the first few minutes. She was warm and direct, with a dry sense of humor that surfaced without warning and made him laugh in the unguarded, surprised way he rarely allowed himself in public. She asked real questions and listened to the answers with her whole attention. When he talked about Noah, tentatively at first, testing the water, she didn't glaze over or offer the polite, generic response of someone marking time. She leaned in slightly. She asked what Noah was like, what made him laugh, what he was afraid of. And James found himself talking about his son with a fullness and an ease he hadn't experienced with anyone outside of family. He described Noah's current obsession with volcanoes. He described the elaborate maps Noah drew of imaginary countries, complete with hand-invented languages and very official-looking borders. He described the particular way Noah slept, one arm thrown across his face like a tiny, exhausted professor. His voice had softened without him noticing, and the table between them had grown warm with the specific intimacy of two people sharing something true. And then Sophie went quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that comes when someone is deciding to take a step they've been approaching for a while. She looked at him with steady, honest eyes, and she said it in barely more than a whisper. The kind of whisper that isn't private so much as reverent, as though the words themselves deserved to be handled gently. She said that she understood every single thing he was describing. She said she had a daughter named Rosa, who was 4 years old, and that she had been raising her alone since Rosa was an infant. And then she said the words that changed the temperature of the entire room, "I'm a single mom too." James did not speak for a moment. He looked at her, this woman he had allowed himself to like carefully and at a careful distance, and he felt something inside him shift the way tectonic plates shift, slowly and with great finality, rearranging the landscape into something new. He had not expected to feel less alone tonight. He had come to this dinner hoping only not to embarrass himself, hoping only for a pleasant few hours in the company of someone interesting. He had not imagined this, the extraordinary, almost overwhelming relief of being truly, specifically understood. They stayed at the restaurant far past the point when their plates were cleared. They talked about the isolation that no one warns you about, the way single parenthood can make you feel simultaneously surrounded by love and profoundly, persistently alone. They talked about the negotiations you make with yourself about happiness, about the invisible line between protecting your child from disruption and protecting yourself from ever feeling anything. They talked about guilt, and about the slow, difficult work of deciding that you are allowed to also be a person. Sophie described the first time she'd left Rosa with a sitter to have dinner with friends, and how she'd sat in the restaurant checking her phone every 3 minutes and finally left early, not because anything was wrong, but because she hadn't yet learned how to be in a room that her daughter wasn't also in. James laughed with deep recognition and told her about the time he'd attended a work happy hour and spent the entire 45 minutes he was there calculating how quickly he could get home. By the time they stepped outside, the street was quiet and cool, the kind of night that holds its breath. They stood together for a moment without rushing toward the end of the evening. Sophie pulled her coat closed and looked up at him, and James saw in her face something he recognized from his own mirror on the rare evenings when he caught himself feeling cautiously, tentatively okay. The look of someone who had been through something hard, who had not been broken by it, and who was still willing to hope. He drove home slowly, in no hurry to end the quiet of his own thoughts. His mother-in-law's car was in the driveway. Inside, Noah was asleep in his bed, one arm across his face in exactly the way James had described to Sophie earlier that evening. He stood in the doorway and looked at his son for a long time, filled with a love that had no edges. Then he walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer, and took out the crayon card Noah had made. He read it once more. "Don't be weird." He smiled, a real, tired, full smile, and set it back gently. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if Sophie would be part of his story or simply a kind and significant chapter in the longer book of his becoming. What he knew, what he carried home with him like something precious, was that tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had sat across from someone and felt the particular grace of being known. And sometimes, on the long road back to yourself, that is exactly enough to keep walking. If this story found you tonight, if it reminded you that love is patient and life can surprise you in the most tender ways, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel Kindness. Leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you believe in second chances, because every single comment reminds us why we tell these stories. We'll see you in the next one.